Ravi lived a quiet life on the edge of town. He was not rich and he was not poor. He worked hard for many years, saved his money, and finally bought a piece of land outside the busy city. The land was not small. It stretched far, covered with green fields, a few old trees, and a wide path that connected to the main road. Ravi liked the silence of it. He built a small house and planted vegetables near it. He thought life would stay calm, but one morning a letter came. It was from the neighborhood association, the HOA. He had seen their sign before when he drove past the other side of the land, but he never thought it had anything to do with him. The letter was thick, full of pages, and on the first page there was a big number written. It said he owed $250,000 in fines. Ravi stood by his kitchen table staring at the paper. His first thought was that it had to be a mistake. He had never signed any paper with the HOA. He never joined any meetings or agreed to follow their rules. Still, the letter was clear. They accused him of several violations. They said his fence was too high. They said his house was not painted in the approved color. They even said his vegetable garden was against community design. He laughed at first because it sounded foolish. But as he turned the pages, his laughter faded. They had added penalty after penalty. Every month the number grew. Now they were demanding all the money at once. It felt like a threat. Later that day, two men in suits came to his door. They introduced themselves as representatives of the HOA. One man was tall with glasses, the other had a serious face that never changed. They spoke in sharp voices, telling Ravi he had broken many rules and must pay. Ravi listened quietly, then said he never agreed to live under their association. His house was on his land, and he lived by his own rules. The man with glasses shook his head and told him the land was inside the neighborhood boundary. He said all property owners in that area had to follow HOA rules. The other man added that if Ravi refused to pay, they could take legal steps against him, even take his property away. Ravi felt anger rise inside, but he controlled his voice. He asked them to show proof that his land belonged to their community. They only repeated the same words, saying boundaries were set long ago. They left him a second letter, full of legal words, and warned him to respond within 30 days. When they left, Ravi sat on his porch thinking hard. He had never been in such a situation. He loved his land. He worked for it with his own hands. He would not let anyone scare him away. He decided to visit the city office to check the records himself. The next morning he drove to the county building. It was a tall place with glass doors and busy people moving in and out. He waited in line, holding his papers, until he met a clerk at the desk. The clerk asked for his property number and typed it into the computer. After a moment the clerk frowned and printed a long report. Ravi took the report and sat on a bench to read it. At first the words were difficult, but slowly he understood. His land was not only the small piece where his house stood. Years ago, when he bought it, the contract included a much larger boundary. In fact, the entire neighborhood, with its rows of modern houses and fancy lawns, was built inside the borders of his property. He read the report twice to be sure. It was true. The HOA had been sending him fines for living on his own land, but the record showed he was the rightful owner of everything around them. The roads, the playground, the clubhouse, all stood on ground that belonged to him. Ravi leaned back on the bench and let out a slow breath. The situation had turned upside down. He was not the one breaking rules. They were living on his land without knowing it. A mix of shock and quiet amusement filled him. The HOA men had threatened him with legal action, but the law itself was on his side. As he drove back home, he thought of the faces of the two men in suits. They had spoken with such confidence, certain that he was weak against them. He wondered how they would react when they learned the truth. For now he decided to keep quiet and plan carefully. This was no longer about a simple fine. This was about control over the entire neighborhood. That evening Ravi stood in his garden watching the sun go down. His house was small, his life was simple, but now a storm was rising around him. He knew the coming days would bring meetings, arguments, and perhaps battles in court. Yet he also knew he held a card stronger than any threat they could make. He owned the land under their feet. And that truth changed everything. The next morning Ravi woke early. He brewed tea, sat by his window, and read through the property report once more. Each line confirmed the truth. The entire neighborhood stood on his land. Every brick, every lamp post, even the pond with its neat benches by the water, all of it was inside the borders marked under his name. He remembered how the HOA men spoke with authority, pointing fingers, telling him he must obey their rules. Now he saw how wrong they were. Still, he did not want to rush. This was not something to shout in the street. He needed to plan. After breakfast he went to see an old friend named Arjun. Arjun was a retired lawyer who lived a few miles away. Ravi trusted him because he was calm and wise, never quick to judge. When Ravi placed the thick report on his table, Arjun cleaned his glasses and began to read. For nearly half an hour there was silence except for the sound of pages turning. At last Arjun looked up with raised eyebrows. He said it was one of the most unusual cases he had seen. The HOA had no idea they were sitting on land owned by someone else. Arjun explained that if Ravi wanted, he could charge rent for every house, every shop, and every park. The entire neighborhood would need his permission to exist. Ravi smiled at the thought, but he also felt the weight of it. He had not asked for power over so many families. He only wanted peace on his land. Arjun placed a hand on his shoulder and told him to think carefully. Some people in the neighborhood might panic, others might become angry. The HOA leaders would likely fight hard to protect their control. Later that day Ravi walked through the neighborhood quietly, as if he were just passing by. He saw the rows of tidy houses with trimmed hedges. Children rode bicycles on the smooth streets. Neighbors watered plants, greeted each other, and waved. None of them knew that all this land was under his name. Near the clubhouse he saw a notice board. The HOA had posted another reminder about strict rules, warning residents about paint colors, mailbox styles, and even the size of garden decorations. Ravi shook his head. They had built a world of control inside his property. That evening he returned home and made a decision. He would not start with threats. He would give them a chance to correct their mistake with dignity. He asked Arjun to help prepare a letter. The letter was simple. It stated clearly that he was the legal owner of the land where the neighborhood stood. It explained that the HOA fines sent to him were invalid. He invited the leaders to meet and discuss a fair solution. 2 days later Ravi received a response. This time 3 people came to his porch. One was the man with glasses he had seen before, another was the serious-faced man, and the third was a woman with sharp eyes and a confident smile. They introduced her as the head of the HOA board. Her name was Mira. Mira spoke first. She said the letter he sent was amusing but false. She claimed the land belonged to the association and that their records proved it. Ravi did not argue. He handed her the official county report. She skimmed through the first page, her confident smile fading slightly. The man with glasses leaned in to read, his face growing pale. The serious man stayed silent but his jaw tightened. For a long moment no one spoke. Ravi simply stood watching them. At last Mira cleared her throat and said they would need time to verify the document. They left in a hurry, no longer as firm as before. That night the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Ravi could hear voices when he walked near the main road. People spoke of ownership papers, of mistakes in old maps, of secrets the HOA had hidden. Some laughed nervously, others sounded worried. The next morning Ravi went to buy groceries and several neighbors stopped him. One man asked if it was true that the land belonged to him. A woman carrying a basket of fruit said she hoped he would not force them to leave their homes. Ravi answered calmly each time. He told them he was not there to harm anyone. He only wanted fairness and respect. By afternoon, news had spread to every corner of the community. Some people came to his gate with gifts of food and flowers, thanking him for not turning against them. Others came with angry faces, accusing him of lying and trying to destroy their homes. Ravi listened but did not raise his voice. He told them the truth would stand by itself. Inside the HOA office, however, panic was rising. Mira called emergency meetings with the board. They dug through old files, searching for proof that the land was theirs. But every paper they pulled out pointed back to Ravi's claim. The more they searched, the more hopeless it looked. Still, Mira was not ready to give up control. She whispered to her fellow board members that they must act fast before the entire neighborhood turned against them. She spoke of finding legal tricks, of delaying, of creating doubt. Meanwhile, Ravi sat in his small house, looking over the fields beyond the houses. He knew the fight was only beginning. He felt both the burden and the strength of the truth. The HOA had built their authority on false ground. Now that ground belonged to him, and the days ahead would decide how the story unfolded for everyone. The board members of the HOA sat in a large room inside the clubhouse. Papers were scattered across the table, coffee cups half empty, and the air was heavy with worry. Mira sat at the head of the table, her sharp eyes moving from one face to another. The man with glasses tapped his pen nervously, while the serious-faced man stayed still, arms crossed. Mira finally spoke. She said the neighborhood could not afford to accept Ravi's claim. If the people believed him, then all control of the HOA would collapse. They would lose power, lose money, and lose the order they had built for years. She told them they must fight with every tool they had. The man with glasses suggested filing a lawsuit against Ravi. Even if they lost, it would buy time and create doubt among the people. The serious-faced man added that they should spread the idea that Ravi was greedy, that he planned to push families out of their homes. If fear spread, neighbors might turn against him. Mira agreed. She ordered them to start preparing both legal action and rumors. She promised the board that she would not let one man destroy what they had built. That evening, new letters were pinned to the notice boards across the neighborhood. The letters warned residents that someone was making false claims about owning their land. They called him a troublemaker who wanted to take advantage of honest families. The HOA promised to protect everyone from his tricks. When Ravi saw the notice, he felt no surprise. He had expected resistance. Still, he felt a sting of sadness. He did not want to be seen as an enemy. He only wanted fairness. The next day some neighbors began to look at him with suspicion. A group of men near the park whispered as he walked by. A woman pulled her child closer, as if he were dangerous. Yet others greeted him warmly and told him to stay strong. The community was slowly dividing into two sides. Ravi met again with Arjun, the retired lawyer. They sat on the porch under the shade of a tree. Arjun listened as Ravi described the rumors and the new letters. Arjun sighed and said it was a common tactic. When people feel their control slipping, they try to paint the truth as a lie. He advised Ravi to remain calm, keep the documents safe, and wait for the right moment to reveal them publicly. Meanwhile, inside the clubhouse, Mira was preparing her next move. She contacted a law firm in the city and paid them to prepare a lawsuit against Ravi. The papers accused him of fraud, claiming he had forged property records. They demanded he stop spreading lies and leave the neighborhood alone. 1 week later, a thick envelope arrived at Ravi's door. Inside were the legal papers, full of complex words and accusations. Ravi read them slowly, his jaw tightening. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but he also knew fighting a lawsuit would not be simple. He called Arjun, who came at once. Arjun read the papers and shook his head. He said the lawsuit was weak, built on fear rather than facts. He promised they could defend against it, but warned Ravi that the HOA was trying to drain his strength and money through long battles. That night Ravi walked alone along the road that curved through the houses. The street lights glowed softly, and he could hear the laughter of families inside their homes. He thought of the children riding bicycles, the old couple who waved at him each morning, and the neighbors who had brought him fruit. He did not want them to suffer. Yet he could not let the Hoa treat him as if he were powerless. The next morning, something unexpected happened. A group of neighbors came to his gate, holding a petition. They said they no longer trusted the Hoa. They had lived under strict rules for years, fined for small things like garden decorations or parking on the street. Now, hearing that Ravi might own the land, they saw a chance for freedom. They asked him to stand against the board and protect the community from unfair control. Ravi was moved by their trust. He promised he would not abandon them. He told them he wanted peace, not conflict, but he would not allow the Hoa to abuse anyone again. News of the petition spread quickly. More families began to question the Hoa. Meetings in the clubhouse grew tense. Some residents shouted at Mira, asking why she hid the truth. Others stood by her, believing her warnings about Ravi. The neighborhood, once quiet and orderly, was now full of arguments. Mira felt the ground slipping from under her. She called another private meeting with her board. Her voice was colder than before. She said if they lost control, everything they had worked for would vanish. She ordered them to dig deeper, to find any weakness in Ravi's past, anything that could be used to discredit him. But while they planned in secret, Ravi prepared in silence too. With Arjun's help he began to gather every document, every map, and every record from the county office. He wanted to be ready for the day when the truth would face the lies, not in whispers but in front of everyone. The storm between Ravi and the Hoa was no longer a private fight. It was now the talk of the entire neighborhood, and the next move would decide who truly held power. The day of the court hearing arrived. Ravi wore a plain shirt and simple trousers. He was not a man of show, but he carried with him a thick folder filled with documents. At his side walked Arjun, calm and steady as always. They entered the tall courthouse, its wide steps crowded with people. Some were curious neighbors, others were members of the Hoa who came to watch. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with silence. The judge sat high at the bench, his glasses resting low on his nose. On one side sat Ravi and Arjun. On the other side sat Mira with her two board members, along with a team of lawyers dressed in dark suits. The Hoa lawyers spoke first. Their words were polished, practiced, and full of confidence. They claimed Ravi had no right to say the land belonged to him. They argued the documents he held were false, that he wanted to trick families into believing lies so he could take over their homes. Each sentence was heavy with accusation. The neighbors who sat in the gallery murmured among themselves. Some frowned at Ravi, others watched Mira carefully. Ravi sat still, his hands folded, waiting for his turn. When the Hoa lawyers finished, the judge turned to Arjun. The retired lawyer stood slowly, his voice calm and clear. He said Ravi had lived on his land for years without troubling anyone. He explained that every claim the Hoa made was built on words, not evidence. Then he opened the folder and placed the county documents on the table for the judge to see. One by one Arjun showed the maps, the deeds, and the official stamps. He explained how the boundaries were drawn, how the records had been updated, and how the property under question was all registered under Ravi's name. He spoke without anger, letting the documents tell the story. The judge read through the pages, adjusting his glasses again and again. At last he raised his head and asked the Hoa lawyers if they had any evidence to challenge the documents. The lawyers glanced at one another, but none stepped forward. They had no papers to match the ones Ravi held. The silence in the room grew heavy. Some neighbors leaned forward, eyes wide. They had lived under the Hoa's control for years, fined and warned for every small detail. Now they saw the board unable to defend their own words. Mira stood suddenly, her voice sharp. She said it was impossible for one man to own the whole neighborhood. She argued that the documents must be old or mistaken. But the judge asked her to provide proof of her claim. She had none. Slowly her voice lost strength, and she sat down again. Arjun ended with quiet words. He said the truth was not always what people expected, but truth remained truth. Ravi did not wish to harm families or take away homes. He only wanted respect for his rights as the lawful owner of the land. The judge nodded and said he would review the documents carefully before giving a final decision. The hearing was over for the day. Outside the courthouse, reporters and neighbors surrounded Ravi. Questions flew at him from every side. Some asked if he planned to evict families. Others asked if he would charge rent for the land. Ravi raised his hand and spoke slowly. He said he had no wish to hurt anyone. His fight was not against families but against unfair treatment from the HOA. He wanted peace and fairness for all. His words spread quickly. By evening, small groups of neighbors gathered in parks and streets, discussing what had happened in court. Many began to believe Ravi. They remembered the years of strict rules, the heavy fines, and the cold letters from the HOA. Now they wondered if they had been following leaders who never truly held power at all. Inside the clubhouse, however, anger burned. Mira paced back and forth, her voice sharp as she spoke to the board. She accused the lawyers of weakness, the members of disloyalty, and the residents of foolishness. She swore she would not allow Ravi to win. The man with glasses asked what they could do now. The serious-faced man suggested delaying tactics, more appeals, and spreading more rumors. But Mira shook her head. She said they needed something stronger. She planned to call a community-wide meeting, where she would speak directly to all residents. If she could turn enough people against Ravi, the court decision would not matter. While Mira prepared her plan, Ravi sat at home with Arjun. The old lawyer advised him to remain patient. The law was on his side, but the hearts of the people were just as important. If the neighbors stood with him, the HOA's power would crumble on its own. That night Ravi lay awake, listening to the crickets outside his window. He thought about the fine that started it all, the two men in suits who once stood on his porch, and the heavy envelope of threats. Now the truth was shining through, but the fight was far from over. He knew the next days would test not only the law but also the trust of the entire neighborhood. The notice appeared on every street corner. A large meeting was called at the clubhouse. Attendance was marked as mandatory. The HOA announced that all residents must come and hear the truth about the land dispute. The bold letters promised answers, but the tone felt more like a command. On the evening of the meeting, the clubhouse filled quickly. Rows of chairs were set up, and people squeezed into every space. Some came curious, others nervous, and a few came angry. At the front stood Mira with her board members beside her. The man with glasses shuffled papers, the serious-faced man stood like a guard, and Mira raised her hand for silence. She began to speak with energy. She told the people that the neighborhood was under attack by lies. She said one man had come forward, claiming to own everything, but his goal was selfish. She painted Ravi as a greedy landowner who wanted to take control of their homes. She reminded them of the safety and order the HOA had provided for years, keeping lawns tidy, streets clean, and houses uniform. Without the HOA, she warned, chaos would spread. Her words stirred some of the crowd. A few nodded in agreement. But others shifted uncomfortably. They remembered fines for simple things, like leaving toys in the yard or painting a door the wrong shade. Still, Mira pressed on, her voice rising with passion. She told them they must unite against Ravi, stand strong, and reject his false claims. At the back of the room, Ravi sat quietly. He had not planned to attend, but several neighbors asked him to come. He wore the same plain shirt as always, holding no notes, only a small folder of papers. When Mira finished, she raised her hand again. She asked if anyone wished to speak. Several people shouted support, praising the HOA for keeping order. But then a woman stood up from the middle rows. She held a petition in her hands. She said her family had lived under the HOA for 10 years, and in those 10 years they had paid countless fines for things that never hurt anyone. She said they were tired of fear. She handed the petition to Ravi, showing dozens of signatures already collected. The room grew noisy. Some clapped, others shouted against her. Mira's face tightened, but she tried to smile. She said petitions meant nothing against the law. But before she could continue, another neighbor stood up. Then another. Soon voices rose from every corner, some telling stories of unfair fines, others praising the HOA for discipline. The clubhouse became a storm of voices. People argued with each other, pointing fingers, shouting over chairs. The calm order Mira once promised was nowhere to be seen. At last Ravi rose from his seat. He did not shout. His voice was steady and clear, cutting through the noise. He said he had never wished to harm anyone. He explained how he discovered the truth about his land, not through rumors but through official records. He held up the papers, the same ones the judge had seen, and invited anyone who wished to read them after the meeting. He reminded the crowd that he had lived quietly for years, never troubling anyone. The fines he received were what forced him to look deeper. He asked a simple question. Who had shown evidence so far? Who had only spoken words? He said truth needed no shouting. Truth only needed patience. The room fell silent. Neighbors looked at each other, thinking about his words. Some faces softened, others stayed doubtful. But the balance was shifting. People began to see the difference between loud warnings and quiet facts. Mira tried to regain control. She stepped forward, her voice sharp again, calling Ravi a liar and accusing him of twisting the law. But her words no longer carried the same weight. Too many people had heard the calm in Ravi's tone, too many had seen the papers he held. When the meeting ended, small groups gathered outside under the streetlights. Some walked away whispering about the documents, others spoke openly of leaving the HOA. The board members stood together, whispering nervously. Mira's confident smile had disappeared. As Ravi walked home, several families joined him. They thanked him for speaking with honesty. One man said he felt free for the first time, even if the fight was not over. A young woman carrying her baby said she hoped Ravi would protect them from losing their homes. Ravi promised again that he sought peace, not conflict. Back at the clubhouse, Mira met with her board. She slammed her hand on the table and declared the fight was far from finished. She swore she would not let the neighborhood slip from her grasp. She ordered her members to prepare stronger tactics, even if it meant bending the truth further. Ravi, sitting on his porch that night, watched the stars above. The meeting had changed the game. The community was no longer silent. They had seen the cracks in the HOA's armor. The next step would decide everything. The battle was no longer just about land. It was about trust, power, and the right to live free from fear. The days after the community meeting were tense. The neighborhood had never felt so divided. Some families whispered about moving away, unsure of what the future held. Others gathered quietly with Ravi, asking questions and sharing their own experiences with unfair fines and strict rules. Ravi spent each morning walking through the streets. He spoke to neighbors with patience, answering concerns and showing them the official documents proving he owned the land. Some families were hesitant, still influenced by Mira's warnings. But the more they saw his honesty, the more trust he gained. Meanwhile, the HOA was not idle. Mira called an emergency meeting with her board in the clubhouse. She paced back and forth, her voice sharp. She demanded new plans to regain control. The man with glasses suggested contacting the media, portraying Ravi as a man trying to confuse the community. The serious-faced man recommended filing another lawsuit, this time claiming damages caused by Ravi spreading rumors. Mira nodded. She was determined. She told them that if they lost control, everything they had built for years would vanish. She demanded immediate action, insisting that every letter, every notice, and every rumor be used to sway the residents back to their side. Ravi, however, was not worried. He knew the truth was on his side. With Arjun's help, he began preparing community meetings of his own, this time inviting residents to review all the property records together. He wanted transparency. He believed that if neighbors saw the documents themselves, they would understand the situation clearly and make informed decisions. On a bright Saturday morning, Ravi set up a meeting in the small park near his home. Tables were lined with papers, maps, and charts. Families came with curiosity, some with doubt, others with hope. Children played nearby, while adults gathered around, ready to listen. Ravi began by explaining how he had discovered the boundaries of his land. He showed maps from the county office, highlighted the plots, and explained the legal ownership. People leaned in to look closely. He answered questions calmly and clearly. No shouting, no threats, only facts. Slowly, the atmosphere changed. Neighbors who had doubted him began to nod. Some whispered to each other, pointing at the maps and confirming what they were seeing. Others took notes, eager to understand their new reality. Families who had once supported the HOA began to question the board's decisions. Back at the clubhouse, Mira received word of Ravi's meeting. Her face darkened with anger. She called her board members, demanding updates on their own efforts. But reports were grim. Several families had already attended Ravi's session and were now questioning the HOA's authority. Mira realized that controlling the truth was impossible. She instructed her team to escalate further, but even her members were growing hesitant. They had witnessed the calm confidence of Ravi and the evidence he presented. Doubt had begun to creep in. As the week passed, more neighbors joined Ravi. They came with questions, shared stories of past fines, and asked how the community could function fairly without fear. Ravi explained a simple idea. He promised that rules could exist for safety and cleanliness, but they would be fair and transparent, not tools for punishment. Families began to smile, relax, and even volunteer to help with small projects in the park and streets. The HOA, seeing their influence shrink, tried one last effort. They sent letters warning residents that the property was under legal review and that Ravi might charge rent or force families to leave. Some neighbors were concerned, but many had already seen the truth firsthand. They came to Ravi, asking him to speak and reassure them. Ravi stood calmly before them. He said he had no desire to charge anyone or evict families. His only goal was fairness and honesty. He reminded them that the land had always been his legally, but he wanted to protect the neighborhood as much as he wanted to protect his own home. The words resonated. Families began to trust him, and hope spread through the community. By the end of the week, the HOA's power had weakened significantly. Mira and her board were desperate. They had lost control of the narrative and faced a neighborhood that now saw Ravi as a protector rather than a threat. His patience, honesty, and transparency had built alliances that could not be shaken by fear or false claims. Ravi stood on his porch that evening, watching the sunset over the wide streets. Children played on the sidewalks, neighbors talked and laughed in small groups, and the neighborhood felt alive in a way it had not in years. He knew the fight was not completely over, but for the first time, he felt that the balance had shifted. The community was awakening, and the truth was stronger than any threat the HOA could make. The coming days would bring new challenges, but Ravi was ready. He understood that ownership was not just about papers and boundaries, it was about trust, respect, and the courage to face opposition with honesty. The sun rose over the neighborhood, casting golden light on streets that had once felt controlled and tense. Children ran freely along the sidewalks, their laughter echoing in the morning air. Families tended gardens, mowed lawns, and spoke to each other without worry. The neighborhood was alive with a sense of freedom it had not known for years. Ravi walked along the main road, greeting neighbors who waved and smiled. He carried a calm confidence, knowing the truth had finally reached everyone. Families who had once been fearful now approached him openly, asking questions about future plans and offering help with community projects. Ravi welcomed their energy and suggestions. Inside the clubhouse, Meera and her board gathered one last time. The room was quiet, filled with tension. Meera's eyes darted around, searching for a solution, but her confidence had vanished. Letters of complaints and petitions had arrived daily, all siding with Ravi. The families no longer trusted the HOA. Meera spoke softly, almost to herself. She said that their authority was gone and that resistance was no longer possible. The board members nodded silently. They had fought hard, but the truth and transparency of Ravi's actions had broken the control they once held. Meanwhile, Ravi organized a small meeting in the park. The goal was simple: discuss how the neighborhood could function fairly under his ownership while respecting the families living there. Maps and legal documents were displayed, but the focus was on dialogue and community. Ravi listened as families suggested improvements to roads, playgrounds, and shared spaces. He took notes, smiled, and promised that all decisions would be fair and transparent. Children gathered near the fountain, pointing out flowers and birds. Their laughter reminded everyone why the neighborhood had to be a place of peace and joy, not fear and fines. Ravi watched them and realized how much control had been weighing down the community. Now that it was gone, life could bloom again. By midday, neighbors began working together to repair small issues in the neighborhood. They painted benches, cleaned streets, and planted new trees. Ravi joined them, carrying tools and water, helping wherever he could. People who had once been divided were now united by a shared purpose and trust in Ravi. Even Meera and her board quietly observed from the clubhouse. They saw neighbors laughing, talking, and working together without following strict rules or fearing penalties. They realized that the neighborhood had moved on. Their control was no longer needed, and perhaps it had never been necessary at all. Later that evening, Ravi gathered the community for a small celebration in the park. Tables were set with food, drinks, and simple decorations. Families brought chairs, blankets, and smiles. The atmosphere was light, warm, and full of hope. Ravi stood before them and spoke gently. He thanked the neighbors for trusting him, for speaking the truth, and for working together. He said ownership was not just about land, but about caring for each other and building a community together. He promised that all future decisions would involve them and that fairness would guide every choice. The crowd cheered softly, feeling a weight lifted from their shoulders. Some families came forward to offer help formally. They volunteered to maintain parks, organize events, and support neighbors in need. Ravi accepted their offers gratefully, knowing that a community thrives only when people care for each other. That night, Ravi returned to his small house at the edge of the neighborhood. He looked out over the streets, the playgrounds, and the homes now filled with peace. For years he had lived quietly, unaware of the power hidden in his land. Now he realized that power was not for control, but for protection and support. Stars filled the sky, and a gentle breeze moved through the trees. Ravi thought about the journey from the first find to the calm and unity of the present. It had been a long fight, full of uncertainty, challenges, and fear. Yet honesty, patience, and respect had carried him through. The next morning, the neighborhood woke to a new routine. People moved freely, greeted each other warmly, and worked together without fear. The HOA no longer sent letters, fines, or warnings. Meera and her board quietly stepped aside, realizing their time had ended. The community now belonged to the people and to Ravi, not through control, but through fairness and trust. Ravi smiled as he walked along the streets. The children waved, neighbors waved back, and birds sang in the trees. Life had returned to the neighborhood, brighter and happier than before. He understood that true ownership meant responsibility, care, and unity. The long fight was over, but the lessons remained. The neighborhood had learned that honesty wins, fear fades, and communities thrive when people work together. Ravi's land was his, but more importantly, his heart belonged to the neighborhood that now trusted him completely. As the sun set over the horizon, casting golden light across the streets and gardens, Ravi stood at his porch, peaceful and content. The neighborhood was free, alive, and ready for a new chapter. A chapter built on trust, fairness, and the courage to do what is right.